It's quite something different, however, to say that the death penalty, which did exist then, the people knew what it was, and the people did not vote to abolish it when they adopted the Eighth Amendment. It's quite something different to say it is now covered by the Eighth Amendment. It's not a new phenomenon. Anyway, go on.
No, but that's quite, now we're getting to a part which is actually rather difficult. So when I get into these real cases, I probably will say what's key is there was a value, there was an objective, phrased in quite general terms, that existed in 1789 and 91 and exists in unchanged form today. The value, the basic purpose, the objective. And then I will look to see how that applies. So to go to a real case where, in fact, the court held that that cruel and unusual punishment clause forbids the execution of those who commit a serious crime of murder, for example, under the age of 18. We said they couldn't be executed. It was not the fact that in 1791, probably there were executions of 17-year-olds. I'm sure there were. But the value that underlies the cruel and unusual punishment clause. Is it cruel? Is it unusual? Those things look around today to see how society today works out what is cruel, what is unusual. And society there may have changed. It's not the values that's changed. It is the nature of society that's changed. And the fact
you picked a bad case because, in fact,
bad for who? For you or for me?
For you, of course.
Well, otherwise, you wouldn't bring it up.
I wouldn't have brought it up.
Right. That's right.
The majority of the states that have the death penalty permitted it for someone who committed the crime when he was under 18, but it didn't make any difference to the court. The court, being an evolutionist court, just said, we think that you shouldn't be able to execute anybody who was under the age of 18. Now, again, I take no position on the merits of it. Maybe you shouldn't be able to, but the people are able to pass their own laws and abolish it, and it doesn't seem to me it ought to be up to 5 out of 9 lawyers on this court to say, coast to coast, you can't execute anybody who committed a crime when he was under 18. The people never voted for that limitation upon democracy. And that's what happens whenever you impose a constitutional limitation, mostly from the Bill of Rights. What always happens is you are imposing a limitation on democracy. You are telling the people you can't do what you want to do.
Point here to the subtlety of this view where you look to conditions really in the world in light of the value is that it is complicated and subtle. For example, there are a large number of states that did have on the books statutes that said you can execute someone under the age of 18, say a 17-year-old. But if you look at the number of states where such executions occurred, there were virtually none, very few. And then if you looked around the world, and this was very controversial whether you should say this, but if you looked around the world, we were the only country in the world, indeed, in practice, that did such a thing. Is that relevant? Well, you know what the framers said about whether it's relevant? What do you think they said? Nothing. They told us nothing about it. And if you look to see what they did, sometimes they looked abroad to certain places. Sometimes they didn't. Hence, there is ground for disagreement. One other point, and that is, in respect to the question of leaving things up to the elected branches, neither the originalist view nor the view of what I'd call more flexible, let's call it, evolutionary sounds a little odd. Let's call it, what should we call it? I want some positive thing here. What about concerned with the conditions of life? What about, well, in any case, you see what it is. It's hard to predict which view will lead to greater freedom for the electorate to change things. I cannot resist pointing out that if you look at the numbers, probably I have been more willing in constitutional cases to allow the electorate to choose matters for themselves than some of those who hold the originalist view. So that's a wash.
Oh, I doubt that. But I mean, the question is, who made you king? I mean, the world has changed, but who placed it in your hands to change our Constitution the way you think it ought to be changed in order to account for these changes?
And
the people can do that. They can abolish the death penalty under 17. And as for the notion, well, they had it, but it's very rarely used, it's also very rarely used to execute women. Now, are you going to abolish, is that the next case we have? You're going to abolish the death penalty for women because it's very rarely used?
I never discuss a case that hasn't arisen.